In the final chapters of Alexei Navalny's life, a series of brutal events unfolded.
I sip from the bottle, so this nerve agent was not inside of a bottle, but on the bottle.
Illegal imprisonment, harassment, and even 3 failed assassination attempts on his life.
Alexei Navalny, a rival to Russian President Vladimir Putin, is recovering in Berlin after the suspected assassination attempt.
But nothing ever broke his spirit. Until his dying days, Navalny continued to speak up against the Putin regime.
If I want to fight Putin, I have to organize people.
And even in death, his story has become a tale of martyrdom and the heroic efforts of a modern activist. Join us as we explore how he became Putin's #1 enemy, the shocking truth about his death, and the FBI's terrifying new discovery about Alexei Navalny that changes everything. The death of a martyr. February 16th, 2024, around 4:19 p.m. Moscow time, the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service announced that Russian opposition activist and political prisoner Alexei Navalny had tragically passed away while in prison. Prior to his death, Navalny was serving a 19-year prison sentence in a corrective colony located in the village of Karp in the Russian Arctic. He was just 47 years old. As soon as the news hit the airwaves, the whole world erupted in protest and demonstrations. And that's because even though the government continues to deny it, there's something fishy about his death. As we attempt to shed light on the truth behind Navalny's death, we take a trip back to his very last day on Earth. According to a statement published by the Federal Penitentiary Service, the day Navalny died was just another typical day at the facility. At a point on that day, he decided to take a walk through the facility, but as soon as he got back from that stroll, he simply collapsed and lost consciousness. Medical workers from the colony rushed to revive him, and an emergency medical team was instantly called. Within just 7 minutes, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and medical personnel rushed to perform resuscitation measures on Navalny. Unfortunately, though, after more than half an hour had passed, and Navalny remained unresponsive, he was officially declared dead. His cause of death was ruled as sudden death syndrome, supposedly caused by a blood clot. But is that really what happened? Or is the Kremlin desperately trying to hide something? Could there be more to this death than meets the eye? Let's examine the evidence. Eyewitness testimony. The man who saw everything. Going by the official version of this story, this is an open and shut case. He took a walk, he slumped, and he died. Simple. But by examining the events that happened before that very day, some inconsistencies begin to emerge. Unfortunately, since this is Russia where censorship reigns supreme, the only truth that usually comes out is the version the government wants its citizens and the rest of the world to believe. However, thanks to revelations released by an inmate who is also incarcerated at the facility, some new information has emerged, shedding light on what really happened on that fateful day. According to this inmate, everything actually started on the evening of February 15, the day before Navalny's death was officially announced. That evening, the inmate noticed some unusual activity at the prison, which seemed to indicate that there might be an ongoing surprise prison inspection. Inmates were locked in their barracks, and the following morning, a thorough search was conducted, which was pretty strange. By 10 a.m. that day, an announcement was made in the prison, informing everyone that Alexei Navalny had passed away. However, this was well before the press was informed of Navalny's death. So why was the information withheld from the public for so long? That's not where it ends, though. The prisoner also noted that it was after everyone found out that Navalny was dead that the first aid appeared. So why were they trying to revive him when they already announced that he had passed away? This was only indicative of one thing. According to the inmate, Navalny was presumably dead on February 15, and the authorities were just trying to find a way to hide the truth. So they waited till their side of the story was carefully drafted before telling the public what was going on. But that's not even the most incriminating evidence. The human rights group Gulagu.net pitched in on the case, revealing that they had gained access to privileged information from within the prison. This inside source revealed that 2 days before Navalny lost his life, several officers from the Federal Security Bureau, which is Russia's version of the FBI, arrived at the prison to disable the audio and video monitoring equipment, raising suspicions about an impending secret operation. Added to that was the fact that Navalny's body had several bruises, although the prison authorities claimed those injuries were sustained during the post-mortem process. But why would the government want to take Navalny out? How did this simple politician become Putin's #1 enemy? A thorn in the flesh. Every controversial leader in history has always been matched by a worthy archenemy. For Hitler, it was Karl von Ossietzky, and for Putin, that archenemy was Alexei Navalny, a staunch political activist who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and definitely couldn't be silenced. During his lifetime, Navalny was a thorn in Putin's flesh, which was why all fingers pointed to the supreme leader of Russia following Navalny's tragic passing. It was in 2010 when Alexei Navalny first emerged onto the national stage, but he brought a kind of political opposition Putin had never seen before. Unlike other movements that often focus on vague politics, Navalny was in tune with the popular concerns of the people, and he was able to find common ground across both the nationalist and liberal activists. His mission was clear: the removal of President Vladimir Putin from office, which will lead to the birth of a new Russia. Sure, Navalny isn't Putin's most popular opponent. As a matter of fact, the Kremlin had soiled his reputation so badly that even if he stood toe-to-toe with Putin in a fair election, he would still lose. So the problem wasn't his popularity, but the way he carried out his activism. When he first dipped his feet in the precarious sands of politics, it was during a fight with Russian energy companies. Instead of protesting against their activities from the outside, Navalny bought stocks from these energy companies, which gave him the privilege of attending shareholders' meetings. It was during these meetings that Navalny would then voice his opposition, while also using his access to defy the corporate leadership. At times, he would even release official documents to demonstrate his malfeasance. He didn't stop there, though. In an attempt to give the Russian people a voice, Navalny established the Anti-Corruption Foundation, an organization which collected citizens' reports on several corrupt Russian politicians. Not surprisingly, the foundation has now been labeled a foreign agent by the Russian government, which means the Russian government has a free rein to attack, persecute, and imprison the people behind the movement without breaking any law. But instead of slowing down, Navalny simply intensified his efforts, embarking on another campaign called the Rosyama Project, which literally translates to Russian hole. Rosyama was a platform through which Russians could report potholes, which was a huge problem in Russia back then. The citizens could then track the government's response. A new era emerges. The man who wants to change the world makes a million enemies, and so was the case with Alexei Navalny. He was a bold, defiant, and outspoken man who spit fire into the eyes of Putin and his men without caring about the consequences. His fight took a new turn in 2011, when he labeled Putin's ruling party the party of crooks and thieves. Everyone knows how ruthless Putin is, and how he silences anyone who stands against him. But Navalny didn't care. He spoke the brutal truth no one else was willing to say. Whenever there was a protest against the Russian government, Navalny was at the forefront, leading every march and championing every movement. In one of those protests against election fraud in December 2011, Navalny addressed a crowd numbering tens of thousands, and he said, "I see enough people here to take the Kremlin right now, but we are peaceful people and won't do it just yet." It was a bold statement that echoed into the corridors of power, and from then on, he became a primary target for the government. But backing down was never an option for Navalny. He forged ahead and joined the Coordination Council of the movement, and began forging ties across the diverse opposition movements, uniting them with their common goal, which was to save Russia from Putin. A new kind of revolution. One of the secrets to Alexei Navalny's movement was his canny use of social media. You see, when he came on board, Navalny introduced the Russian people to new insights and ways to protest against the government. Using the resources from these protests, activists, themes, online fundraising, and new coalitions, Navalny was able to build an opposition strategy that closely monitored elections and the performance of the government. At the sight of any discrepancy, the opposition movement would launch a massive protest to voice the concerns of the Russian people. Young activists, journalists, and ordinary Russians put their voices together, championed by Navalny to demand change. However, the Russian government wasn't going to be patient with a man like Navalny forever. They'd arrested him many times, but that never stopped him. They tried bribing him, convincing him, spoiling his image, and even threatening him, but nothing ever seemed to work. So in 2017, they decided to take him out for good. First, chemical attack. Although the Russian government wanted Navalny gone, this was not a cartel or criminal organization that could just order a hit. The operation had to be done in the most clandestine way possible. This way, no one will be able to boldly state that the Kremlin did it. On April 27, 2017, Navalny was attacked by some unknown assailants outside his office in the Anti-Corruption Foundation, who sprayed brilliant antiseptic green dye mixed with some other components into his face. The Zelyanka attack was so brutal that the activist lost 80% of the sight in his right eye. However, his doctors held on to hope that the lost eyesight could still be restored. He would later accuse the Kremlin of orchestrating the attack, while identifying the assailant as Alexander Petrenko, a man he claimed had ties with the State Duma deputy speaker Pyotr Olegovich Tolstoy. No one was ever arrested for the attack, but thankfully, Navalny made it out alive, although the green remained on his face for a while. But that was just the beginning. The next attack was even more brutal. Second chemical attack. 2 years after the Zelyanka attack, Navalny was targeted again. This time it was almost fatal. This was in July 2019 when Navalny was arrested and imprisoned for his actions against the government. On July 28, Navalny suffered severe damage to his eyes and skin after what the officials called an allergic reaction. However, when he first started screaming in pain, no one paid attention. The prison officials handled the case so sluggishly that it took the intervention of Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalnaya, for him to finally be taken to the hospital. However, the injuries Navalny suffered were inconsistent with an allergic reaction, and when people noticed, they started questioning the official narrative. One person who vehemently stood against the report was Anastasia Vasilyeva, one of Navalny's personal doctors. Vasilyeva questioned the diagnosis and suggested the possibility that the activist was attacked with undetermined chemicals. Thankfully, though, Navalny made it out alive again, and by July 29, he was okay enough to go back to prison to serve the rest of his term. Even though the doctors made it very clear that his health would deteriorate in prison, the authorities sent him right back as soon as he was up on his feet. First, poisoning. The moment Navalny was released from prison, he was on the move again, plotting and planning new ways to expose the secrets of the Putin regime. But they never kept their eyes off him either. The next attack came in August 2020, a time when the activist was extremely vocal about his political views. In the days leading to the attack, Navalny had been posting several videos on his YouTube channel in which he expressed support for the pro-democracy 2020 Belarusian protests. The protests had been triggered by the 2020 Belarus presidential election, where widespread discrepancies were reported. Navalny lauded the revolution that was taking place in the country, and he prophesied that the same kind would soon erupt in Russia. Around the same time, Navalny was reportedly carrying out an investigation, which took him to Siberia. He would later post the video of this investigation on August 31st, but before then, he had to fight for his life. 11 days earlier, on August 20, Navalny took a flight from Tomsk to Moscow, but after a short while, he started writhing in pain. It was so intense that the passengers could hear him crying loudly as the crew members rushed towards him. The plane had to make an emergency landing in Omsk, and Navalny was promptly rushed to the City Clinical Emergency Hospital No. 1. He was placed in a medically induced coma and had to depend on a ventilator for days. At first, the doctors acknowledged that he had probably been poisoned, but soon the terminologies began to change, and the hospital's deputy chief physician told reporters that poisoning was just one scenario among many being considered. When the diagnosis came out, the doctors initially claimed that Navalny had suffered from a metabolic disorder caused by low blood sugar. However, This diagnosis was soon thrown out the window when new reports showed that he was most likely poisoned by antipsychotics or neuroleptics, and that industrial chemicals such as 2-ethylhexyl diphenyl phosphate were used in the attack. But the problem was, the only thing Navalny took that day was a cup of tea he was photographed taking at a Tomsk airport cafe. By afternoon that day, his wife Yulia had reached the hospital from Moscow, and she brought Navalny's personal doctor, Anastasia Vasilyeva, with her. But they didn't allow her to see her husband. Instead, the officers demanded proof in the form of a marriage certificate to confirm that she was indeed Navalny's wife. For hours, very little was done to save his life, and the authorities kept everyone away from him. A chartered plane paid for by the Cinema for Peace Foundation was sent from Germany to evacuate him away from Omsk for treatment at the Charité in Berlin. After approximately 34 had passed since Navalny first slumped on the plane, a doctor from the German team was finally granted brief access to the activist. He recorded bradycardia, hypothermia, and that his white pupils didn't react to light. It also turned out that the only treatment the Russian doctors had administered was a shot of the sedative propofol. The situation was dire, and something had to be done fast. But the Russian doctors insisted Navalny was too sick to travel, so the Germans' hands were tied. However, after a whole lot of back and forth, he was finally released and arrived in Berlin on August 22. A dark chapter. Navalny in coma. 2 days after Navalny arrived in Germany, the head doctor at the Omsk hospital, Alexander Murakovsky, organized a press conference to address the case. He revealed that they had saved Navalny's life as soon as he touched down, and that there were no traces of any poison in his system. He also explained that the doctors at the facility were not under any pressure by the Russian government. However, this turned out to be a poorly planned damage control. When the doctors at Charité were finally done with their diagnosis, the results were shocking. These clinical findings indicated poisoning with a certain nerve agent known as a cholinesterase inhibitor. Thankfully, though, the brilliant doctors were able to save him from yet another attack. On September 7, he was finally brought out of the medically induced coma, and the entire Russia erupted in jubilation. By September 10, though, threats had begun coming in, and the security at the hospital had to be stepped up. 4 days later, Navalny was taken off the ventilator, and he was finally able to get out of bed. Everyone heaved a breath of relief as the activist slowly recovered from the brutal attack. But that peace wouldn't last for very long. The homecoming. On September 15, Alexei Navalny dropped the bombshell news that he would return to Russia. Everyone was shocked to discover that the activist was still willing to risk his life just so he could confront the Putin government. But the Kremlin rules out any meeting between Navalny and Putin, denying him the audience he really needed. Navalny also posted a picture from his hospital bed, which was the first time his face would appear on social media since the poisoning. On September 22, the doctors at the Charité hospital declared him well enough to be discharged from inpatient care, and Navalny left the hospital. Throughout these times, he maintained his position that Putin was behind the poisoning. He asserted that only 3 people could give orders that would necessitate the use of Novichok, the nerve agent that was employed in the poisoning. Director of the FSB Alexander Bortnikov, Foreign Intelligence Service head Sergei Narishkin, and the director of the GRU. However, none of them could have made such a decision without the go-ahead for Putin, so Navalny decided this must have originated from the man himself. However, the Kremlin continued to deny that any such thing had happened, unknown to them that the truth was about to come to light. Who poisoned Navalny? As Navalny got better, everyone turned to the all-important question: who poisoned Navalny? The search was on both locally and internationally, and his team worked round the clock to uncover the truth behind the assassination attempt. Anti-Corruption Foundation employees in Tomsk quickly told the administration of the hotel where Navalny had stayed that he could have been poisoned by something from the minibar, so they pressed for permission to inspect the room. The request was granted, and the inspection was done in the presence of a hotel administrator and a lawyer, and it was also filmed for record purposes. Several items belonging to Navalny were retrieved from the hotel room, including plastic water bottles. It was on one of these bottles that investigators found fragments of a chemical warfare agent, but their suspicions still hadn't been fully confirmed. On September 2nd, 2020, the German government announced that the scientists working on the toxicology report had obtained undeniable proof that Navalny was poisoned by a Novichok-type nerve agent, although the technical details were not released. However, the investigations took a new turn in January 2021, when it was finally revealed that the same FSB unit which was responsible for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov and the poisoning of Dmitry Bykov was also responsible for Navalny's case. Just before the investigation was published, though, Navalny hopped on the phone with the FSB operative that carried out the mission. What they discussed was nothing but shocking. The man behind the mask. This is Konstantin Borisovich Kudryavtsev, a high-ranking Russian FSB agent who's also known as the man who poisoned Alexei Navalny. Digging him out was no easy task, and Navalny had to dig into his wealth of experience to get the man to admit his involvement. This was how it unfolded. Shortly before his infamous investigative piece was released, Navalny obtained the phone number of Konstantin Borisovich Kudryavtsev, and he placed a call to him while posing as an aide to the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev. During the call, Navalny pretended to debrief Kudryavtsev about the operation, asking for the details of why the mission had failed. It worked like magic, and the FSB agent revealed everything. He said that the Novichok agent had been applied to Navalny's underwear while he was staying at the hotel in Tomsk. But while Navalny wore them on the flight as planned, the poison, which can also be absorbed into the skin, must have taken too long to do so, which was one of the reasons Navalny was able to make it out alive. The FSB agent also attributed his survival to the prompt action of the pilot to turn the plane around, and the fact that an antidote was administered almost immediately. The audio recordings of this incriminating call was released on December 21, 2020, and is still available for anyone to listen to. As expected, though, the Kremlin dismissed the recording as a total forgery, calling it a provocation that would not have been possible without the organizational and technical support of foreign special services. However, despite the fact that he had just survived an attempt on his life by the Russian government, Navalny was hell-bent on going back to Russia. So on January 17, 2021, he got on a flight back to Russia, despite the numerous pleas from his supporters, who knew he would be arrested as soon as he set foot in Russia. This turned out to be the beginning of another dark chapter in the story of Putin's worst enemy. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. As we explore how the FBI's terrifying new discovery about Alexei Navalny changes everything, we uncover new details about his last 24 hours. Why were the surveillance cameras and audio monitors disabled just 2 days before Navalny's death? Why did they conduct an emergency search? And why did they claim he died from sudden death syndrome, which meant that his heart just stopped beating for no reason when it's clear as day that there was foul play here? As the mysteries continue to unfold, share your thoughts with us on this case in the comments. Now let's get back to the video. The final chapter. Days after releasing the recording, Navalny received a last-minute ultimatum from Russia's prison service, telling him to fly back to a Moscow office on December 29, 2020. Failure to do so would be considered a violation of his prison terms, which meant that he would be jailed as soon as he set foot in Russia. But Navalny wasn't in good shape yet at that point, so he didn't go. A couple of weeks later, on January 12, a Russian judge ruled that Navalny be jailed in absentia for several infractions, such as having allegedly broken the terms of a suspended sentence. But even with the impending danger, the activist maintained that he would return to Russia as soon as he was okay. That day eventually came on January 17, 2017, when Navalny flew into Russia from Germany, only to be arrested as soon as he touched down at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport. This illegal arrest provoked outrage from the international community, and several world leaders released statements drumming their support for the freedom fighter. As for Navalny, he was remanded in a pre-detention center for 30 days after a court hearing was hastily prepared at a police station on the outskirts of Moscow. While in jail, Navalny asked his supporters to take the streets and protest against the oppressive government. However, this time around, the Russian government was determined to send the activists away for good. By February, an extra 2.5 years prison term was added to Navalny's sentence, apparently for some parole violation. It was during this time that he staged his infamous 3-week hunger strike, protesting against the lack of medical treatment and adequate sleep. In March 2022, another extra 9 years were added to his sentence, this time for embezzlement and contempt of court, all of which were fabricated just to keep him in prison. By April 2023, Navalny had suffered from extreme weight loss and acute malnourishment. His doctors also claimed he was having some severe stomach pain, which was suspected to be due to a slow-acting poison. According to Navalny's spokesperson Kira Yarmish, the prison food was also contributing to the decline in Navalny's health, but the officials didn't allow him to buy or eat other food. On August 4, 2023, another extra 19 years was added to Navalny's sentence, based on charges of terrorism and extremism. But the man's spirit couldn't be broken. Anytime he appeared on video conference calls for court sessions, he was always bubbly and full of life, but he was dying, and it showed. While in prison, Navalny was kept under very strict conditions. He would often be severely punished with solitary confinement for simple infractions like not making his bed or not standing properly. His communication with the outside world was also restricted, and although he saw his lawyer from time to time, Navalny was only allowed to write a letter every month. These letters were often made into videos that were posted on his YouTube channel, so his supporters could get his message. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for his body to finally break down, and on February 16, 2024, Alexei Navalny took his last breath in a Russian prison. His real cause of death is still being investigated. A nation in mourning. As tributes started pouring in following Navalny's death, so did the condemnation from several Western leaders, blaming Putin for the death of the political commentator. European Council President Charles Michel took to sea to express his condolences, adding that the European Union holds the Russian government responsible for Navalny's tragic death. European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also expressed condolences on X, saying, "Putin fears nothing more than dissent from his own people, a grim reminder of what Putin and his regime are all about." U.S. President Joe Biden also released a statement extending his condolences to Navalny's family, while maintaining that Putin should be held responsible for his death. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak also made a post on X, praising Navalny as the most ardent supporter of democracy in Russia, who demonstrated courage his entire life. Other world leaders also expressed their sentiments on the matter, including German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, French Foreign Minister Stéphane Séjourné, and Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani, among others. Several new sanctions were also imposed on some prominent Russian citizens by the United States, the European Union, and other Western allies. This includes travel bans, property seizures, and other restrictions. However, the Kremlin continues to deny any involvement in Navalny's death. Back home, his supporters trooped onto the street to both mourn and celebrate the life and legacy of Alexei Navalny. They gathered in several symbolic places like St. Petersburg, Moscow, and even abroad in Georgia, Lithuania, the United Kingdom, Germany, Bulgaria, Portugal, the Czech Republic, and the United States. However, unlike all these other places, protests are illegal in Russia, and the security forces showed no mercy to the people who gathered to place flowers at a monument they set up for the slain leader. Police detained more than 400 of these demonstrators. Many of them are still not being released. As Russia closes in on the presidential election and the Ukraine war continues to rage on, what does this mean for his continuous hold on power? We'll have to wait and see. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.